1,100 miles southwest of Anchorage, along the shores of a remote island in the cold and dark Bering Sea, is a lonely B-24 that rests quietly where it was skillfully landed on a crisp December evening 82 years ago. The bomber and its crew almost made it back to base. Score another one for Aleutian weather. How did it get there, and why is it still here? Well, let's talk about it. But first, if you're new to my channel, then welcome. My name is Karen, and I've been retracing my grandfather's wartime footsteps through some of the most remote areas of Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, all in an effort to honor his service and the service of those he served with. And that's right, the war came to Alaska, and 144,000 servicemen were sent there to defend the continent, including Canadians. If you want to know more about this mysterious and forgotten conflict in one of the most spectacular places on Earth, then stick around. If you're not new to my channel, then welcome back. Now let's get into it. The wreck is located on Atka Island, somewhere around the middle of the Aleutian chain, just 90 miles east of Adak, which is where the Joint Operations Center was situated during the war. Atka, though, actually has a long civilized history dating back at least 2,000 years. The Ununga town site is located on the southeast side of the island, and when the war arrived, the villagers were forced to relocate to the mainland and their villages burned. At the war's end, they would return, and with them came other displaced persons whose villages were forever lost in the conflict. There's a great book if you want to learn more about the lost villages along the Aleutian Islands. It's called The Lost Villages. It was early morning, December 9th, 1942, when the two pilots, Captain John Andrews and Louis Blau from the 404th Bombardment Squadron, were assigned to take two visiting generals from Washington on a weather patrol out over the Japanese-held islands of Kiska and Attu. The brass wanted to see and experience for themselves what the pilots of the 11th Air Force were claiming to have to deal with, and what exactly was causing all of these weather-related aircraft losses. They departed from Adak, flying 450 miles to Attu, conducted some quite frankly unsuccessful reconnaissance over the Japanese occupation area, which was, surprise, surprise, mostly obscured by fog. And as the off-the-record story goes, that at the request of the generals and much to the dismay of the experienced pilots, they extended their time over Attu with hopes of gaining a glimpse of the Japanese operations before returning to base. They soon found out what a very costly decision this was. Once arriving over Adak, the airfield had become completely covered in fog, including all of the surrounding alternative landing fields. And this was the problem when flying in the Aleutians. Airfields were far apart and flat land almost non-existent. To ditch in the Bering Sea was almost sure death. The alternative airfield options for the B-24 at that time would have been to try the rudimentary Army Auxiliary Field on the southwest side of Atka, which they did, and it was also socked in. Or they could have traveled another 380 miles further east to Fort Glenn with no guarantee that it would be clear, as weather moves fast out there. After 3 attempts to land at Adak with no improvement in conditions, they headed towards Atka. Blau radioed for the latest weather report and learned that the northwest side of the island offered a small window of opportunity for an emergency landing, and in fact, that flat valley was the only land they could see. The bomber came in for a low-level landing, barely clearing the snow-covered beach, and after 150 rough and painfully noisy yards, it came to a halt. The bomber broke in two immediately behind the trailing edge of the wing, and luckily Andrews had ordered all of the crew forward before landing. Most exited unharmed except for the bruised ego and broken collarbone of the general who had insisted on lingering over Attu. Temporary shelter was constructed utilizing the wing and engine covers for the shelter and the silk parachutes as blankets. They were rescued the next day, but not until after a failed attempt to be rescued by a PBY. the sea tender Gillis eventually arrived to complete the recovery. Everyone lived to fly another day for our freedoms. Over time, the wind has scattered pieces of the aircraft all around, and scavengers have picked the bomber clean of any valuable parts. But it's still an incredible sight to see and a fantastic story. Thanks to the great effort of Ted Spencer, longtime preserver of Aleutian and Alaska aviation history, the airplane was placed on the National Register of Historic Places, the first aircraft ever to be listed as a historical structure. Years later, it also became one of the Valor in the Pacific monument sites. And this is why it cannot be recovered and rebuilt. Besides that, though, the logistics in recovering an aircraft from such a remote and isolated place and the costs associated with it would be astronomical. But what do you think? Should the aircraft be restored and recovered, or should it lay where it rests as a tribute to those who flew it? Let me know in the comments. The Aleutian Islands are still scattered with airplane wrecks from the war, so keep watching the channel because I'll start to highlight some of those wrecks in future episodes, because behind every wreck is a pilot, like my grandfather. If you want to join me on one of my World War II history expeditions through the Aleutian Islands, I will leave information on that in the description below. I will also leave a link to my latest project, World War II Aircraft of the Aleutians. It's a book that is free to the public, so make sure you get it. See you next week.